I'm Alessandra Renzi, professor in emergent media in the Arts and Design department and the program for Media and Screen Studies. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here tonight to introduce our guest speaker. Ethan Zuckerman is director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT and the principal research scientist at the MIT Media Lab. His research focuses on the distribution of attention in mainstream and new media, the use of technology for international development, and the use of new media technologies by activists. He's a role model for anyone interested in how the design of technology can improve the standard of living and give voice to marginalized communities and cultures. Professor Zuckerman's engagement with the internet dates back to the early 90s, to the origin of the internet, when he worked at Tripod.com. Tripod started in 1992 as a magazine for students and young adults. And in 1994, it quickly became a web hosting platform where people could create free web pages, competing with the likes of GeoCities and AngelFire. As a place to build online communities, we could say that Tripod is part of the first wave of user-generated content. The list of projects Ethan Zuckerman has been involved in since is way too long to name them all, so I hope I'll do him justice. He's lived in Ghana, where he studied as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Ghana, Legon. For years, he has been involved in the country's development, working with various NGOs and on programming and technology projects. In fact, his website and blog are called My Heart Is in Accra. In 2000, he founded Geek Corps, a technology volunteer corps that sends IT specialists to work on projects in developing nations with focus on West Africa. 5 years later, with Rebecca McKinnon, Professor Zuckerman co-founded the international blogging community Global Voices. Global Voices showcases news and opinion pieces by citizen media in over 150 nations and 30 languages, publishing editions in 20 languages. Professor Zuckerman is also active in promoting freedom of expression and fighting censorship in online communities and spaces. He does so not only through Global Voices, but also through his research at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where he was a fellow for 8 years. His many other affiliations include memberships on the board of the Wikimedia Foundation and the open source mapping company Ushahidi, a very important tool for independent reporting and crisis mapping in places ranging from Kenya to Haiti. He has recently published the book Rewire: Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection, about contemporary globalization and xenophilia. Rewire takes on the myth of endless connection online to reveal the degree to which this connection persists and is even exacerbated. It calls on us to take responsibility for rewiring our lives so as to realize the full promise of global connections. Importantly, to do so, Rewire shows us that we need to think about information architectures as well as social practices. As we will hopefully hear from him today, true digital cosmopolitanism is achieved by eliminating homophilic barriers such as filter bubbles and media bias, and by fostering internationalized media, cultural literacy, and personal connection, which are often helped through translation. To end this introduction, I would like to leave you with a quote from someone from Rewire that can only come from the wisdom and experience of someone who has devoted his life to using technology to build better futures for many people around the world. We need to move towards a physics of connection to produce an understanding of what's necessary to build real and lasting connections in digital space. Please join me in welcoming Ethan Zuckerman.
Alexandra, thank you so much. That's incredibly kind. It's really fun to be here, and I would say for those of you in the audience who end up standing and talking to classrooms often, I highly recommend showing up to give talks about subjects that you don't know a ton about. So just to be really clear for like all of you here who study data visualization, I am not very good at data visualization. This is not my field, but I'm going to try to take some of the concepts that I've been working with around these ideas of digital cosmopolitanism and talk about a particular thread in visualization that I'm finding a lot in my work, both in my practice and also sort of in my analysis. But this is the fun piece of this, is trying to connect what I'm doing with what you guys are doing. And if I do it well, maybe we'll get something good out of it. If not, my Twitter handle's up there. You can tweet these to me. It works just fine. But we're going to start with storytelling, because I find that that's a lot better than sort of jumping in and going straight to the charts. This handsome guy is named Hugo Barra. And I'm guessing no one's heard this name before, but throw your hand up if you know him. Barra is the guy who in many ways was sort of the face of Google's Nexus phone. So Google made this big effort. Not only were they going to develop Android, they were going to develop a mobile phone around it. Barra was the project manager associated with this, and was really one of the sort of 6 or 7 big faces of Google. And so when a little bit more than a year ago, he announced that he was leaving Google and going to Xiaomi, people had no idea what was going on. Most Americans have no idea what Xiaomi is. Hands up in this audience if you have heard of the company Xiaomi, right? So we get our friends from China, and we get one geek in the background. And so this is not a company that most Americans know about, but of course for those in the know, this is a really exciting tech company that has developed its own version of Android, is putting out one of the hottest phones in the world today. They're in extremely short supply. Xiaomi's doing really interesting things with marketing it, where they make it available only in really short runs. It is an enormous status symbol. It's a really cool thing. And like, if you know what's going on, it makes perfect sense why a guy like Barra would say, okay, maybe it's time to try something very different. So here's what the US tech press did with the story of Hugo Barra moving to China. They figured out the real story behind the story, which of course is that Barra used to date this attractive young lady, Amanda Rosenberg. Amanda Rosenberg was a project evangelist for Google Glass. She has been romantically linked to Sergey Brin, and as everybody knows, if you end up with a love triangle with a founder of Google, the only conceivable thing you can do is flee the country and move to China, where Google, of course, has pulled out and no longer has facilities on the ground, because that's the only way that you could possibly work this out. I mean, keep in mind, like, this is Google, man. They've got drones. I mean, lots of bad things can happen. So Barra sort of returns from China 6 months later, gives this amazing talk at Le Web in Paris. And he basically says, look, you guys are idiots. You're all idiots. You don't get this at all. The interesting place to think about the web right now is China. You've got somewhere between 450 million and 600 million internet users. And you've got a net culture that's completely different from what we're used to in North America and Europe at this point. And he starts just sort of going through the ways in which Chinese net culture is different from US net culture. You have Weibo, which has a much more sophisticated way of doing microblogging and incorporating content within it. You have Weixin or WeChat, which actually did what Google Plus wanted to do with circles and actually did it right. It's actually a wonderful way. I use it every day. It's a great way to actually stay in touch with small groups of people. Alibaba, which everyone finally heard about, but specifically Alipay, which turns out to be an extremely effective digital and mobile money solution. You think it's great that Amazon is promising to drop packages off for you within a day? Try JD.com, which is promising 4-hour delivery in many major cities. So you sort of look at this and you go, wait a second, like, how did the American tech industry miss China? Like, China, big country, big place, lots of people in it. And so this way in which we can sort of end up deeply connected and sort of deeply blind at the same time is the phenomenon that I've been really interested in for the last sort of couple of years. And I'm really interested in the ways in which we talk about connection. So as you know from the overly kind intro, I've been doing web stuff for a really long time. And I've been around from the days of the early cyber utopians promising us that where we're heading is a truly borderless society where ideas come from everywhere, products come from everywhere, the Thomas Friedman version of globalization in which labor and capital and goods are completely mobile is realized by the web. And we're getting our information from all over the place, and we're all completely connected with one another. And one of the interesting things about this is that you see this rhetorically, you see this through imagery all the time, coming from companies, coming from entities that are deeply bought into this idea of being borderless and being fully global. But it's really worth sort of picking these things apart and interrogating them and getting a sense for to what extent they're true, to what extent they're leaving things out, to what extent they're not just visualization, but are actually rhetorical statement of one fashion or another. So you're going to see this image a bunch because I'm sort of obsessed with this image. This image for me in many ways had to do with why I ended up writing this book, but I'll come back to it in a moment and sort of explain it to you. So here's the backdrop against this, right? At the same time that we hear about the world getting smaller, the world getting more connected, air flights everywhere, container shipping all over the place, just-in-time supply chains, fully integrated manufacturing, we're actually in some ways getting significantly less news about the world. So it's easiest to measure this on things like newspapers and television. We can look at things like the ABC nightly newscast because researchers have actually been manually annotating those newscasts since 1965. And we can go back and sort of look at them and basically say, what's kind of crazy about this is that about 35% of the stories when we were in the 1970s were international news stories. Now, it makes sense. Vietnam, we're still in the Cold War, but even as we've gotten more and more globalized and more interconnected, we've got much more domestic in terms of where international television news is focused. We actually see the same pattern in major US and UK newspapers. We did a study, replicating a study done in the UK. The UK study looked at 4 major broadsheet newspapers. They sampled a week in 65, 75, 85, 95, 05. And they saw 45% decrease in international content. And that's in absolute terms. That's actually the number of stories shrinking. A paper like The Guardian, Manchester Guardian, which was like that thick in the 1970s, is now like this thick, and it still actually has less international news, despite the fact that it's actually a pretty good international source compared to some of your other options. What's so weird about this is that it used to be really hard to get international news. You had to put people out on airplanes. You filmed film in heavy cameras. You put the film in cans. You shipped those physical cans back over oceans. You developed that film and then you broadcast it. Nowadays, we can put CNN anchors on any spot in the globe and put a phone in front of them and have reports from Anderson Cooper in like 12 hours. And we still somehow manage to get less international news. And of course, a huge part of what's actually going on with this is that generally speaking, we're choosing less international news. So this is work that I did a few years ago, looking at what the audience is for domestic versus international news sites. So this is just looking at really simple stuff like Google Ad Planner. What do we pay attention to when we read the news? And it turns out, actually, the US is pretty cosmopolitan in our news choices. Almost 6% of the news that we read comes from sites run out of the United States. And that includes like all of the BBC, all of the Guardian, Times of London, all of those European broadsheets. It actually turns out probably the single biggest component of that is the Times of India. And that's not read by most average Americans. That's read by Indians living abroad in the United States trying to find a way to stay at home. But this isn't just a US pattern, right? I started doing this research and I was like, well, of course. I mean, this is the US. We're terrible. We don't get more globalized, or we can get more global information as we move more and more online. So for years, I've been mapping what the New York Times pays attention to. It's probably the most prestigious paper in the US. It's the one that everyone looks at to sort of set their news agenda. And the New York Times, it sort of doesn't matter when you do this map's about 6 months old, it tends to have the same pattern. It would be much brighter these days because of Ebola. But generally speaking, unless we're invading someone or we're afraid of getting infected by someone, Africa turns out to be extremely pale. You almost never see anything from Central Asia, very, very rarely get anything from Eastern Europe. We're pretty good via the Times on Western Europe, China, India, the big countries of Latin America. But many of us have been sort of looking at this and saying, well, okay, now we're in a digital age. We can all tell our own stories. There are millions of bloggers around the world. There are people publishing information out on social media. We saw during the Arab Spring people creating their own media. We've got people out there with cameras and Ustream and trying to get information out there. Surely things are getting better. You may have figured out at this point that I'm not going to tell you that things are getting better. This is the Huffington Post, which in many ways is not a bad proxy for user-sourced content, since they basically opened up their content process to pretty much everyone who wants to publish for the Huffington Post. And despite a massive impetus to try to get more international, they're actually significantly more domestically focused than the New York Times ends up being sort of week to week. So it's hard to measure all this other stuff out there. We can think about maps that end up looking different. A map right now of the last month or so probably would have a lot of streaming media coming out of Hong Kong, for instance. But you start looking at this in aggregate, and you do start getting this interesting pattern. You tend to pay a lot of attention to something if you already have a cultural connection to it. And so the more I started reading about this, the more I started sort of writing about this, I found myself looking at this very old concept coming out of social science, which is this idea of homophily. And homophily is the sort of word that you get to use when you want to pretend that you have a graduate degree and you don't actually have it, so I'm going to use it as much as I possibly can. But homophily is basically birds of a feather flocking together. And if you sort of look at the world of social science, it's hard to find anything that has been replicated as often as work on homophily. We find evidence of people flocking to their own groups in terms of what neighborhoods people live in. We find it in terms of what schools people attend. We find it in terms of how people sort themselves in rooms. We are incredibly good at figuring out who our tribe is. There's an amazing study that looks at university public computer labs. And what they ended up finding in this is that people sort by things like the length of their hair, whether or not they wear glasses. You end up with people wearing glasses sitting together. And then you interview people after the fact, and you sort of say, how did you end up sitting together? And they say, that guy looked friendly. There's this very basic tendency to identify those who we are with, those who we are familiar with. And it turns out that these tendencies look like they cross over into the online world. And that in some ways they may actually be stronger in the online world. So in the offline world, we have lots of things that sort of force us to mix. We may choose, consciously or unconsciously, to hang out with a lot of people who share our political values, who come from the same socioeconomic background, but we find ourselves at a great university and we've got a wonderful sort of tool for mixing and diversity. You have guys like Robert Putnam over at Harvard sort of arguing that much of the civic infrastructure that got developed in the United States in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was all about sort of putting together these opportunities to mix. And the reason Putnam is so scared about losing things like bowling leagues is losing some of that diversity, losing some of that chance encounter. Because what we've done, in many cases, is now moved our chance encounter onto social networks. What's the first thing that Facebook does when you sign up? Does anyone here actually remember signing up for Facebook for the first time? The first thing Facebook does is tries to figure out where you came from. So it asks you, where were you born? It asks you where you went to school. It wants to know universities, high school, elementary school. It wants to know where you've worked. What it wants to do is find your group. And the reason it wants to find your group is that Facebook figured out a very, very long time ago that if you have 10 or more friends on Facebook, you'll use it. And if you don't have 10 or more friends, you'll simply abandon it. So there's basically a huge set of people with 10 or fewer friends who tend not to use it. And then there's this sort of enormous jump up to about 160, 170, which is the mean number of Facebook friends. My guess is that most people in this room are friendlier than that. You may have a lot more context than that. But Facebook is desperate to try to help you find those connections, whether or not those are the connections that you might get the most interesting news from. And if you think about this, what Facebook sort of ends up doing is making it very hard to sort of transcend your background. Facebook wants to tie you back to the people you went to high school with, even if you got nothing to do with the people that you went to high school with. And because there is so much self-selection in terms of where we live in the physical world, you end up with these networks that end up surprisingly rooted in the locations that we end up coming from. And what's interesting is that when you look at Facebook's own research, they find this as well. So Facebook is a really tough company to do research with. They won't hand you their data. You can fly there with your laptop and put together queries and hand them, and they'll run them and give you the sets back. In many cases, you're actually much better just sort of calling people within Facebook and trying to get answers to questions. So I got really interested in a question. My question was, how much should we believe this map? This is a map that Paul Butler put together in 2010. And Paul Butler had probably the greatest internship ever. He showed up at Facebook as a data visualization intern. And they said, what do you want to work on? And he said, I don't know. Why don't I graph all interpersonal connections on Facebook? And they said, sure. You know, try to figure out how to do it. And so what he did was he took a tiny, tiny subset of the Facebook graph, a random subset, and he plotted every friendship as an arc of someone who knows someone in another country. And you end up with this image. And what this image is supposed to tell you is this is how Facebook connects people around the world. Facebook loves this image. This image shows up all the time. When Mark Zuckerberg gets interviewed about what Facebook means, why Facebook is changing the world, why Facebook is going to help the developing world, he puts up Paul Butler's image, right? So this image, to me, rhetorically, clearly has some sort of meaning to Facebook. The meaning I think it ends up having is we are a truly global network. We are the connected tissue that's going to tie everybody together. We are finding ways to bring together and unite the world. Anytime you hear someone making overly broad statements, as I am here, it's a good time to look and interrogate them, and sort of try to figure out what's being glossed over in the process. So what's missing here? China's a big one. China entirely missing with the exception of Hong Kong. What else is missing? What's that? Iran is missing. The Middle East isn't badly represented. Russia's missing. Now this is interesting, right? So China has, well, Mongolia is missing for a different reason. China's missing, of course, because China blocks Facebook, right? And China has rival social networks. Russia doesn't block Facebook. Russia just doesn't like Facebook. Russians use to become topped, and they use LiveJournal. They have no interest in Facebook. They tend not to connect with it at all. For me, the biggest thing that's actually missing from this is what the visualization shows us and chooses to hide. What these white connections are supposed to show us is extremely dense interconnection within a country. And it turns out that when you look across the board at what percentage of friendships on Facebook are within the same country, it's about 88%. But what you actually get out of this map from looking at it is the strength of these international ties sort of going all over the world. But those international ties may be the single person in Uruguay who has a relationship with someone out in Mauritius. But visually, that's of course what comes forward in all of these. Now, 88% domestic actually is a really surprising figure. 12% international is kind of a stunning sum to sort of come out of this. So we actually have to dig a little bit further into the data to sort of find this out. Facebook has published a paper looking at who's friends with who. And this comes out of a 2001 paper by a really smart guy named Johan Ugander. And what he basically found is, logically enough, people in the same country, really, really, really strong friendships. In some very occasional cases, you'll have a couple of countries that have surprising overlap across borders. And it tends to be in clusters like Southeast Asia, Europe, Scandinavia. There tends to be a linguistic component associated with this. But the more that we sort of pushed and dug into this data, the biggest thing that we figured out, we tried to figure out what countries were the most cosmopolitan. What were the countries that were most likely to have these sort of international ties to them? I don't want to guess at what nation has the most international ties. What nation ends up showing up as the most cosmopolitan on a Facebook map? Who makes the most friends internationally? No, although really nice guess. And it will turn out to be a nice guess for a couple of reasons. Anybody else? Canada does surprisingly well, although it's strongly domestic. Inland, India's not bad. What was the other one?
I thought it was Iceland.
United Arab Emirates. So the Emirates shows up incredibly cosmopolitan looking at this. Now let's unpack this for a moment. It's not that Emiratis are incredibly lovely, friendly people, although they are. It's that the Emirates has an enormous guest worker population. In fact, the Emirates is really run by guest workers. If you are of Indian origin living in the Emirates, you show up as United Arab Emirates. And your friend network, which is in India, who you're using Facebook to stay in touch with, you suddenly have 99% connections internationally in your network. So remember that figure of 12% international versus 88% domestic? It's crap, because it turns out to be almost entirely people living abroad maintaining their social networks. What Facebook rhetorically wants to tell us is that they're this incredible bridge across language and culture. When you actually dig into it, what Facebook is really great at is allowing you to remain home when you are in another country. And this is something that we've seen a huge amount of as we're seeing sort of digital globalization take place. We're seeing that digital networks allow us to sort of be in two places at the same time. My Ghanaian friends in the United States are still in Ghana because they're watching Ghana films and they're listening to Ghana radio because they're really easy to get over the internet at this point. And they're still part of the same social network on Facebook or Twitter while they have their foot within another country. So this takes me to wanting to try to say something meaningful about data visualization. And what I wanted to talk about is an idea that I talk about a little bit in the second chapter of this book, which is this idea that there's two very different kinds of maps you can make when you're trying to look at a phenomenon like globalization. And the two basic maps that I want to talk about are infrastructure versus flow. And my favorite way to do this is to look at this project called In Transit, which was done by a number of designers at Stamen Design several years ago at this point. Anyone recognize this? Name the city. San Francisco. And what's interesting about this is you start seeing some things that are sort of obvious. You see where the main arteries are, where the main highways are, but you also start seeing things that are totally non-obvious, even if you know San Francisco well. It makes perfect sense that people are commuting from residential areas into the downtown. It makes perfect sense that people are using the highways up from the airport and sort of coming in. These lines turn out to be people commuting to hospitals. It turns out that people often use taxis to get to medical appointments. And so you start seeing these really interesting patterns that sort of emerge from what people actually do within a city. And that's sort of the point of making a map like this. You start seeing not just what's possible, but what actually ends up happening, how people actually choose to behave. You also start seeing really interesting poles, right? So a lot of these poles represent parks. You know, you don't have a lot of taxis driving in parks. Some of these holes represent something entirely different. This, down here, looks like there's no roads. Looks like you basically shouldn't be able to get around there. Turns out actually to be kind of a thriving neighborhood called Hunters Point. It's also San Francisco's historically African-American neighborhood. The answer is you just can't get a cab there. So what you're actually getting from the data of flow is not just what's possible, but what actually happens. When you look at a conventional map drawn the conventional way, you take a piece of aerial imagery, you trace all of the lines, what you're getting is how it's possible to move through a city. But when you start looking at flow, you end up getting very, very different patterns of what actually sort of happens. So I'm a big fan of thinking about how you use flow to model systems. Because when you want to look at something and think about behavior, this sort of map ends up being incredibly deceptive. Because you start looking and saying, hey, that's great. You know, there's all this open space over here, maybe that's where I'm going to live. And then you start looking to see how people actually move through a city, and you find out very quickly that there are certain things that are actually easy and hard that aren't always available just from looking at the infrastructure. What's tricky about mapping flow is that inherently it's about surveillance. So in the same way that the taxi driver is under surveillance, all of us who are walking around carrying iPhones, we are also under surveillance. And you guys with Android devices, you're probably under surveillance as well, because deep within your Google Maps settings are ways to track you in the hopes that Google can try to use this aggregate data to figure out where the traffic is. They're getting some of this from aerial data, but they're getting a ton of this by tracking how we flow through a city. And when you see people flowing very, very slowly on I-90, you can then color it dark red. And so flow maps almost inherently involve watching people's behavior. And they raise some really uncomfortable questions about, are we okay with watching this? Are we okay with sort of paying attention to this? I tend to get very interested in looking at these maps of flow on sort of a global scale. So this is what we might think about as an infrastructure map of what's possible globally. This was put together by a guy named John O'Sullivan, who's a graphic designer who was out of work for a while in 2009 and decided to take on the project of mapping every airline route in the world. And one of the really interesting things about this, if you see it in the really blown up version, you'll see it actually outlines the African continent, it actually outlines South America. It's just that those connections are so thin in terms of what actually ends up happening there, they literally just sort of fall off the map. And you end up with this sort of connected megalopolis of the east coast of the US and Europe, and sort of the way that they very thickly get tied together. You actually get something surprisingly different from the flow piece of it. So this is a visualization done by a Swiss university, and it's using the data from flightstats.com. And FlightStats has every air scheduled. And this is not actual air data. No one's looking at plane transponders. They're simply looking at the routes that these take and sort of thinking about how this flows over the course of a day. And what you get out of visualizing the flow is a couple of things. You suddenly start figuring out that that sort of megalopolis between North America and Europe sort of wakes up, goes away, passes from one to another. One of my favorite things in this is discovering that it's actually not very clear from the infrastructure map, but you have domestic Chinese air traffic and increasingly domestic Indian air traffic that is at least as dominant. You have these loose connections coming into Africa and South America. You have no connection between the two. You start ending with these very heavy dependencies of where those flows end up sort of connecting. And so they end up giving you very, very different pictures. For me, the biggest picture in all of this is, again, how much of this is domestic. It turns out that about 87% of airline flights in the world are domestic airline flights. The average airline flight is about 700 miles. You are far more likely to stay within your country than you are to sort of go elsewhere. So the reason I'm interested in this is that I think these maps show us something very different. I think infrastructure maps show us what's possible. I think flow maps show us what actually happens. And then I think we actually can sort of think about a third type of map, which is maybe an intent map. So if we think back to the airline routes, and if we think back about sort of where we go, the infrastructure shows us what's possible. It's possible to make the commute from Western Massachusetts to West Africa. I used to do it all the time. It's a really stupid thing to do. It's not particularly easy, but it is absolutely possible. The flow shows you sort of how ludicrous it is and how unlikely it is to actually do. And then somewhere in all of this is the intent of where people want to go. You start drilling down into airline maps and you often discover that they are really weird products of old colonial borders. West Africa, where most of my work has been over the years, is this weird patchwork of Anglophone, Francophone, a couple of Portuguese-speaking, 2 Spanish-speaking countries, and they're all connected together by language, even though they tend to trade with their neighbors. So you try to do something really logical, like fly from Ghana to Burkina Faso, which share a border, and you have to go through Paris, despite the fact that there's huge amounts of people sort of going back and forth and trading. So infrastructure and flow don't necessarily guarantee that you're getting what you want. Neither of these necessarily shows you intent. They show you what's possible and they show you what happens. And so a way to think about this is looking at how we map social networks. This is the truly exhibitionist part of the talk. This is a fun tool. This is called TouchGraph. And TouchGraph is a very powerful tool set to pick apart Facebook. You can download these tools. You can run this as Java in the browser. And this is Facebook looking at 100 of my friends and calculating what they think my social network is, who they think is most important to me. Who do we think Facebook thinks is most important to me? Guesses within this? Myself, obviously that's true of all social media. So these folks show up very big. And what's interesting about this is from looking at my own social network, I can tell you some of them should be really big. This guy runs Global Voices. I talk to him every day. This is one of my major collaborations on internet censorship issues. I have no idea who this dude is. I used to work with her 15 years ago. As it happens, she runs design for Facebook. So I think she managed to just sort of put herself in that. What Facebook is doing is it's not looking at my behavior. It's looking at how we're tied together. If we have a lot of friends in common, we get sewed together very close in the network. And so Ivan and I both work for Global Voices. We're both friends with 300 people from Global Voices. We get tucked right together. Margaret and I both worked at Tripod. We've got 70 people together from Tripod. We get tied right together. We may not ever talk to one another. We may have no idea sort of what's going on in each other's lives. But this is a map of how it is theoretically possible for me to get information in the social network. These are people who could be feeding me information, and Facebook might decide that these are the ones likely to feed me information because of their proximity. Who's most important in this social network? Yes, that's my wife. This tends to work a lot better. This is a tool my friend Cesar Hidalgo and his team built called Immersion. And Immersion does something that's pretty cool and also pretty creepy. You can use it. It's awesome. You should try it. Immersion logs into your Gmail account. And it looks at all of your email headers. And what it does is it tries to make a graph of everyone you have exchanged 2 or more emails with. And then it clusters those people together in terms of whether you CC'd them at the same time. And so it turns out this is the Berkman Center at Harvard, where I used to work. This is the Center for Civic Media at MIT, where I currently work. This is Global Voices, where I periodically work. These are other orbits that I end up in for different reasons. My wife shows up really big because we trade a lot of email, because I live 150 miles away from home. But she has almost nothing in common with anybody else in here because we don't end up corresponding at the same time. That first graph, that touch graph, is much more analogous to the infrastructure of social networks. This gets much closer to the flow that we might want to see within them. Again, I would point out, it doesn't necessarily give you intent. It doesn't give you who you want to be talking to, how you want your communications to be. My biggest shock when I put this out and started publishing this is that within the red are a lot of my grad students. And you could suddenly see which grad students I was corresponding with a lot and a little, And I'm a nice guy, and I'm trying really hard to be in touch with all of them and trying to be sort of even and sort of fair. And this actually shows you basically like how bad I am. And how bad, we all sort of tend to be at sort of trying to figure out how you balance those sorts of social relationships. So my point in talking about all of these things is to try to find a way to sort of pull apart the rhetoric of visualizations when visualizations are trying to talk to you about things like the globe. And so here I find myself drawing a little bit on critical theory. There's this wonderful book that if you're going to write about globalization, you're going to write about our vision of the world, you pretty much have to read Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. And what Anderson does is he basically says, look, the world is way too big to know. And nations are way too big to know. We can't really imagine America. We might be able to imagine this university. We might be able to imagine small parts of this city. We might be able to imagine places we've traveled. But imagining America, we have to imagine very indirectly. We might imagine America as the people who read the same newspaper that we read. We might imagine America as the people represented on the same shape on the map. We might imagine America through an institution like a museum of American history or American culture. And so Anderson basically says, this notion of nations, this notion of where we are in the world, it all has to do with these constructs that we use to imagine ourselves as American or Chinese or British. And he looks at things like maps and the notion of the British Empire imagining itself as truly globe-spanning with the sun never setting, which still remains true, oddly enough. Lots of little islands. They still manage to occupy, even if you don't have threats all over the place. But his argument is that this map is a way for Britain to imagine itself, and imagine itself as including India, imagine itself as including East Africa. So one of the things that I've been wondering about is how do we imagine the possibilities that these maps open up? And I spent a lot of time looking at maps from the early 1900s. And this wasn't just arbitrary and just because I like maps. Something really interesting happened at the beginning of the early 1900s. Anyone want to guess what percent of people worldwide are living in a country other than the country they were born in? So what percent of people in the world right now are living as immigrants, living outside of their home country? Shout out a number.
12%.
12 is interesting. 10, 5, 20, 3. It's 3%. So lots higher in the US, about 13% in the US. 3% globally at this point. Lots and lots and lots of countries where there's very, very little immigration. There's a lot of emigration. Think China, think India. There aren't huge international populations living there. Any guesses, knowing that it's 3% now, any guesses what that number was in 1910? 14%. So you had roughly 4 times as many people living overseas about 100 years ago than you did now. If you look back in history, people talk about the first great age of globalization as being about 1890 to 1910. Crazy. You see quotes of like, it's amazing. A man who lives in London can pick up the telephone and order a product from anywhere in the world and have it delivered directly to his room. And this is 1910, and this is what people are talking about. And this is an age of globalization that looks like it's going to rule until you hit World War I. But associated with this age of globalization is all this rhetoric coming out in the maps of this time. And so you see maps of telegraph connections showing you that news can literally make it around the world as early as 1891. You have maps like the American Express Company showing you, much in the same way that DHL or FedEx or someone would like to show you, that they can deliver anything to anyone. The most amazing of these things as rhetorical devices are railroad maps. Railroad maps are freaking insane. So what happens in the US is during the railroad boom, railroads acquire property from the US government. They get 1 mile on each side of the tracks that they build going out into the west, and they own that land. And they own it 50-50 with the US government. So half of the land goes to the government to sell, half of it goes to the railroad barons to sell. And they need to sell it because this is how they're financing their railroads. So their rhetorical tool for doing this is they print up maps. And the maps are incredibly detailed. They show you town after town after town in areas like rural Nebraska. And the really slick, sinister ones name them things like Rome, Paris, Oslo, these sort of names of great cities. They print them out. They print them out in Norwegian, they print them out in Polish, and they hand them out to people landing in New York, coming off a boat, and essentially say, this is where you want to be. And of course the answer is, there's nothing there in most cases. There is a railroad line running off into infinity. And if you are crazy enough to move to Gothenburg, thinking that this might be a nice place as a Swede to settle in central Nebraska, you are very lucky if you find a small cleared patch of land, at which point you are completely dependent on the railroad for anything that you are going to get in terms of supply, any sort of information that's going to come to you. But the map is a very, very powerful form of rhetoric. It has a way of creating a reality, and there's a sense in which this is true. Gothenburg could exist. You can get to it. It is theoretically connected through that map of steamship and rail that could get you back there. But a flow map would make this a whole lot clearer about what sort of actually happens and what is actually possible. You are not going to be surprised to hear that I'm going to argue that we have done the same thing with the internet. We started mapping the internet in earnest in the early 1990s. And in a longer version of this talk, I would take you through all the different visualizations of the internet, how we've represented it over time. I'm going to cut to the chase and take you to 2005, where we stopped mapping the internet because we got to such a point of complexity that this didn't look like a map that any human could follow. This looks like a slice of the human brain. And I would argue that that's actually precisely what these people wanted to make the point of. That we have hit this point of hyper-connection where this thing doesn't even feel like a machine anymore. It feels like this organic thing that starts holding us together. But we still map it in some cases, and we map it mostly when we want to sell things. Do you guys know who Akamai is? So Akamai, big content host, they run big servers. When people demand your content, my talk's so popular, everyone's going to go swamp my website. I should sign a deal with Akamai to make sure that all of these people located in all of these parts of the globe can suddenly get to my site. But all of these maps have very clear choices about what they're representing and what they're not representing. One of the interesting things that the Akamai web is all about is it's a map of demand. If you actually looked at where these people all over the world were trying to go, the vast majority of them were trying to go to California. They're trying to go to Google, they're trying to go to Facebook, they're trying to go to this tiny concentration of places. Akamai is actually trying to decentralize the web. They want you to put your content all over the place, trying to demonstrate to you that those users are all over the place. And they're also very interested in some users and not very interested in other users. Because Akamai doesn't care if you've only got a little internet usage. They actually put up a break where if you don't have 1.5 million people per second downloading content, they're not even going to show you on the map, because at that point you would be unlikely to be a client for their services. So my point on all of this is, when we're mapping things, we're almost always trying to make an argument. We're trying to persuade people of things. We're trying to persuade people that something is possible. We're trying to persuade people that they need something. We tend to think of maps as these wonderful sort of objective documents. And like any other sort of visualization, they are necessarily making choices of what to include and what to pull out, which means they are necessarily persuasive and political documents. So I want to stop by talking a little bit about some other ways that people are sort of thinking about mapping and mapping flow. One of the sites that I use incredibly heavily when I try to talk about globalization is this very, very beautiful website people move in. So again, only 3% of the world living in countries outside of their country of origin. Huge tendency to assume that everybody is leaving their country of origin and heading for the United States. Totally untrue. Almost all migration is to near neighbors. It's almost always across immediate borders. And what People Move In does is it's a beautiful way of mapping flow out of these different nations and into different nations by showing proportional ties of where it's going. It turns out for Afghanistan, there's a huge number of people going into Pakistan, huge number of people going into Iraq. You would also discover that no one leaves Aruba. That's also sort of nice to know. We're seeing a lot of maps right now thinking about the flow of people. And I'll tell you that if you're working for the WHO right now, you are living in the land of these maps right now. Because this is a map trying to figure out how SARS spread and how a small number of patients showing up at a small number of hospitals ended up potentially exposing a huge number of people and then actually infecting a small number of people. Now these maps are really interesting because they do give you the sense of this international connection. You find yourself very quickly going from National Taiwan University Hospital over to Canada because of who's coming together and who's moving apart. But it's also very interesting to sort of think about the fact that when we really have to, we can actually pull flow down to who encounters who and sort of pull it down to the individual person, often without actually interviewing people in the process. I'm very interested in visualizing the flow of stuff. I lean really heavily on my friend Leo Benani's work. Leo has a wonderful project called SourceMap. And what SourceMap is doing here is trying to unpack what's in my laptop and looking at the flow of goods that sort of come into it. So he's looking at rare earth metals coming from Australia. He's looking at wafer fabrication happening in different places over the world. There's a huge number of sources coming together, including design and architecture and all of this. But these maps also end up missing something. They end up missing the value add. They end up missing how the money's changing hands on all of them. They're giving us sort of one possible view of the flow of stuff, but not necessarily the flow of money or property associated with it. I'm obsessed with media, so what I'm mapping these days and trying to figure out how to map in terms of globalization is what we look at and what we pay attention to. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is collecting about 50,000 media sources and trying to map who, what, and where we pay attention to get down to a really fine-grained detail so that we can ask questions about what do we pay attention to when we pay attention to a country? Who are the figures who show up in the news? Who gets quoted? What are the topics that end up showing up? How do things differ from the baseline? With a tool like this, we can start going back in time and essentially saying, how do we normally talk about Sierra Leone? How do we normally talk about Liberia? What are those moments where we might actually choose to talk about something and compare them to sort of the moments that we're talking about now? My students have gotten very interested in trying to map who we're listening to. And so this is a project that my student Nathan Matias put together called Follow Bias. Nathan knows that I am obsessed with Twitter. I get a huge amount of my information from it. I like Twitter because it's asymmetric. I don't have to be your friend. If you're smart and writing something smart about Occupy Central in Hong Kong, I can follow you, and it's a nice way for me to diversify my information sources. And Nathan, being a good PhD student, which is to say a major pain in the ass, got really sick of me talking about the diversity of my social network, and so wrote a tool to look at gender. And so he looks at everyone that I'm looking at on Twitter. He's using algorithms to guess at the gender of who I'm following, and quickly discovers that I'm following twice as many men as women. And that, generally speaking, I'm following almost as many brands as I'm following women. And if you do this, by the way, you're probably going to find that this is true for you too. We've tried this with a bunch of journalists, and it turns out, even for women, men tend to be much more aggressive in demanding follow-backs. Men, in many cases, are posting quite a bit more. Many people end up with badly gender asymmetric networks, my dear friend Dana Boyd used the tool and discovered that her personal network is roughly 50-50 male-female. Her professional network is 80-20 in terms of men to women. But trying to make these things visible, making visible what's your actual behavior within these systems instead of what you think and hope you will do. And so I thought I would end by showing a really fun project that we've been working on called What We Watch. And What We Watch is based on our fundamental feeling that world peace is not going to come from the UN, it's not going to come from negotiations between world leaders, it's not going to be an energy summit, it's going to be when we all discover that what we want to do is watch Bollywood dance videos. And we're figuring this out by mining YouTube for information. YouTube publishes what are the most popular videos in any country on any given day. And if you start storing this up, you can do things that are really interesting. You can say, here are the videos in the last 30 days that Ghanaians really dug. And you can find out pretty quickly that Ghanaians and Nigerians have an enormous amount in common. Actually, 20% of the same videos over that last month were watched in both countries. And you can start figuring out who's close to whom, who's paying attention to the same things. You end up with really interesting things. Ukraine and Russia are at war, but they're watching the same videos. And they're watching the same videos because they have the same common language, because you have a huge number of Russian speakers within Ukraine, because you do have a common culture. You may have a stalled conflict, but at the end of the day, Ukraine and Russia have a cultural link that nobody else sort of has within this. You remember that I talked to you guys before about UAE and how it sort of shows up in the center of the networks? We've done networks based on video behavior and exactly the same thing happens. UAE and Singapore end up being the central nodes in the network because you have huge numbers of people living abroad using video as a way to sort of connect things out. And so for us, when we start asking these questions of what spreads, not physically, not where the goods spread, not where the people spread, where do the ideas spread, where does the culture spread, our hope is that this starts being a way of sort of backing into those networks. Who's paying attention to whom, who's looking at the same things, who's paying attention to each other's culture, and watching these things sort of spread around. So that's a lot of what I work on. The goal was to stop here and actually have some time for questions. You guys have been really patient. Thank you.